Hello, police. Yeah, what's the problem, sir? We just drove down our farm track. Yeah. Go and feed our pheasants. We come across a Range Rover with 3 people in it. Yeah. It appears that they're dead. I don't know what's happening. Blood in the motor all over them.
And welcome back to a new video on the Essex boys' murders. In this video, I'm going to be discussing something a little bit different, a different motive for the murders of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe. Now, this was put forward by the prosecution during the trial of both Jack Holmes and Michael Steele, the 2 men who were ultimately convicted of their murders. Now, many people won't actually know this, I doubt, but back during the trial, Darren Nichols, along with the prosecution, put forward the idea that Pat Tate was potentially a police informant. Now, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the story surrounding this, and then I'm going to go into it into quite a bit of detail from Darren Nichols' own words. Now, what I find quite interesting about this story personally is that some of the details are actually backed up by, I guess you could say, independent third parties. So we're not just solely relying here on the word of Darren Nichols. Some of the events I'm about to tell you about are also backed up by Donna Jaggers, who at the time was Craig Rolfe's long-term girlfriend. But anyway, that aside, let me just give you a brief idea of what this story actually entails. So as many of you will know, Michael Steele and Jack Holmes, toward the back end of 1995, brought across a shipment of cannabis from Holland over to the UK. This was done under the cover of darkness. This was a trip that they had done many times before with no issues. But on this occasion, they were caught, or I should say nearly caught, by the Coast Guard, customs officials, and even the police got involved, and the boat was subsequently searched. Now, luckily for these 2 individuals, they had offloaded the drugs at a safe point and nothing further was done. Where the whole suspicion arises concerning Pat Tate is in regard to what happens next. Now, we have Steele and Holmes being questioned about this boat being landed in suspicious circumstances, and that obviously ties in with Michael Steele's previous history of drug smuggling, so they're there questioning Steele and Holmes. And at this point in time, Pat Tate is actually being held at another police station after crashing Tony Tucker's black Porsche. Now, Craig Rolfe and Donna Jaggers go to collect Pat Tate from the police station, and as soon as Tate enters the Range Rover, he knows that Steele and Holmes have been arrested. The first thing he does is call up Jackie Street to check that the drugs are okay. Have they been offloaded in a safe place? Have they been caught with all the drugs? And this is where the suspicion starts. How did Tate know that Steele and Holmes have been arrested, having been, in the cells, if you will, or in the custody suite himself, at a police station many, many miles away? Anyway, I'm going to now get into this story in full. We're going to hear from the word of Darren Nichols, his recollection of going over there and purchasing these drugs, and also, in a lot more detail, the arrest and questioning of both Michael Steele and Jack Holmes. I just got in from cleaning the car when the phone rang. It was Mick being all weird and casual. He said he was having a few friends around for a drink that afternoon at Angels Green, and why didn't I pop over? Oh, and could I bring my fishing gear with me because he wanted to borrow it? So I gathered up my waders, a change of clothes and my passport and said goodbye to the wife. I knew we were on for another run. I drove over in my Scirocco, parked in the driveway and then walked up the path. Mick met me at the door and ushered me into the living room where I saw Jack Holmes and Peter Corey already sitting down chatting. The other thing that caught my eye was this enormous pile of money on the coffee table. A pile so big that depending on where you sat, you couldn't actually see some of the other people around the table. But no one mentioned it. The others nodded hello and Mick told me to get myself a drink. I walked over to the fridge and got myself some beer, then came and sat with the others, so the pile was blocking out Corey. Then we all started talking about this and that until the conversation died down, and suddenly Mick grabbed a pile of money off the table and started flicking through it. And then Jack and Peter started doing the same. Then Mick said to me, "Don't just sit there like a prat, Darren, grab some money and start counting." It turned out it wasn't just one big pile after all. It was several smaller piles all gathered together. There was supposed to be 76,000 from Tate and friends, 28,000 from some friends of Mick's down south, £14,000 from Jack Womes, and Mick had put in a little bit himself to make up a total of £124,000. But nothing was taken on trust. We each had to count each person's money, then hand it on to someone else for check-in. I don't think anyone was particularly surprised when Pat's bundle turned out to be £200 short. Mick wrote a note to himself so he'd remember to subtract the difference from the amount of drugs he gave to Pat. Then we bundled all the cash into a bag so that Corey and I could get on our way. Although Corey hadn't put any money into the deal, Mick once again insisted on giving me the big speech about if there's any decisions to be made, Corey should make them because he was the experienced one. Then just like before, he gave me, rather than Corey, the radio. "What do you reckon the weather will be like for the crossing this time, Mick?" I asked. He shrugged. "All right, I suppose. Certainly not as bad as the last time we came over." That wasn't what I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear it was going to be the worst crossing ever, that Corey was going to hate every minute of it. "Well," I said, "I'll keep my fingers crossed for the two of you." The plan this time was for Corey and I to take a ferry as a couple of foot passengers and then hire a car once we got to Amsterdam. Although there's no real border between Amsterdam and Belgium, Mick was always concerned that a British car driving between the two was far more likely to be stopped than a local one. As far as he was concerned, we'd been lucky up until then, but now he didn't want to take any extra chances, especially as he had gone over the magic £100,000 mark for the first time. On the way down to Harwich, in the light of what Mick had said, I made the decision that I was going to make a real effort to get on with Corey, but somehow he managed to start pissing me off almost straight away. When we got to the docks, he refused to buy the tickets because he didn't want to be seen by the cameras. Then he refused to carry the money through customs and insisted on walking through on his own 10 minutes after I'd gone through, just to be sure he could say he wasn't with me if it all came on top. But I suppose the thing that really got to me was the way he spent so much time bragging about what a big man he was and how so many people were scared of him. The truth was, he was a spineless twat with no bottle, and I was lumbered with him. We got a cabin on the boat, and I left Corey there to look after the money, while I went off to have a few drinks in the bar and then went to the casino. I lost a fair bit of money, but I didn't care. I stayed there for the rest of the trip just so I could avoid Corey. The next morning, Paranoid Peter was living up to his name in full. He made sure that I carried the money through Dutch customs when we got off the ferry, and he stayed a little way behind me. Then he insisted that I book the train tickets in my name, and when the ticket inspector came along, he made sure it was me who had the money, just in case. But when we got within spitting distance of Stone's Calf, he had a sudden change of heart. "Give me the bag," he said. "Eh? What for?" "Look, don't fuck about. You know I'm in charge here. Just give me the fucking bag." I didn't have the energy to argue. I thought, sod it, if he wants to look like the big man as if he's been the one in charge of the money the whole time, then let him. This time, Harris was waiting for us along with one of his Dutch partners when we got to the calf. I'd seen this other guy hanging around before. He was the one who led me out of the city the first time when I bought the drugs from there. But this was the first time he'd actually been there while we were striking the deal. He didn't say anything the whole time, he just sat in the background making me nervous. We wanted grass, but Harris checked with his partner, then said there wasn't any around. That seemed fair enough. After all, the first time we'd gone over there, he didn't have anything at all. So we settled for resin. We fixed the price and I checked the exchange rate on teletext. It worked out that we were getting the stuff for £1,125 per kilo, roughly half of what it would be worth once we got it back to Britain. It was pretty much then that the problems began. Corey started getting the money out, emptying his gear including his dry suit onto the floor, and Harris looked over and said, "Oh, what's that?" So as quick as a flash, I said it was a flying suit for the helicopter. Corey looked at me as if I was totally mad, like I'd lost the plot. "Don't be soft," he said. "It's my waterproof for the boat." He then looked at Harris and raised his eyes to the ceiling like I was some kind of moron. I was still trying to think on my feet, trying to save the day. "Yeah," I said, "but I only use the boat if they're having a problem with a helicopter, but it's fine today." Now, I'm no expert in the drug business, but one thing I do know is that you don't trust anybody, and you don't tell anybody any more than they need to know. It's just too big a risk. And telling your supplier just how you're getting the stuff out of the country is pretty fucking high up on the list of things not to do. But that's just what Corey had done. And to make it worse, Corey didn't even realise how daft he had been. That was the first hiccup. The deal was done, and the next step was to hire a car to drive to Belgium. Me, Dopey Harris and Corey took a cab over to Eurocar where I'd pre-booked a Toledo. I filled in the forms, smiled at the man behind the counter and handed over my credit card. He ran it through the machine, frowned and handed it back. It had been declined. The car company asked if I knew how much I had left on my limit, and I told them about £250. That turned out to be the problem. They used to charge only £200 deposit, but had had a spate of people hiring cars, then sodding off to Germany and selling them for a huge profit. Since then, they'd upped the amount of the deposit to £500. Harris was not impressed, and wasn't about to let me use his card, while Corey didn't have one, so we were buggered. In the end, we went back to the bar and I used Harris's payphone to call the TSB back in Braintree and ask if there was anything I could do. They said if I could get someone to pay in cash at my local branch, they would credit it on my card immediately. I got straight on the phone to Sandra, who then had to go rushing about like a blue-ass fly trying to borrow money off of people. Within about an hour, she had got £300 together and paid it in. So the three of us got another cab back over to Eurocar. This time, Corey realised he'd left all the bags in the boot and ended up chasing this cab about half a mile down the road until it stopped at some traffic lights. I don't think Harris was particularly impressed at that either. He must have thought we were some kind of slapstick comedy duo trying out for Dutch television rather than a pair of serious drug smugglers, but I guess our money was as good as anyone else's. We finally got the car, drove back to Harris's and parked it in a road around the corner from the bar to wait for the drugs to arrive. About 10 minutes later, Harris and two cronies turned up carrying 5 cardboard boxes between them. I'd expected the drugs to have been packed in bags or wrapped in plastic. That's the way they'd always come the last couple of times. But Harris just mumbled something about not having any bags in stock and proceeded to dump the boxes in the boot. We didn't have time to argue. All the problems with hiring the car had put us well behind schedule and only had a couple of hours to get to Belgium. Once we got on the motorway, I just followed whichever car was going the fastest and hoped that if anyone got stopped, it would be them and not me. The last thing I needed was another speeding ticket. We got to Blankenberg with a few minutes to spare, so I bought some bags from this supermarket across the harbour, and Corey and I started transferring the drugs over. In our rush to leave Amsterdam, I hadn't realised just how badly packed the drugs were. Even the individual blocks hadn't been wrapped up properly. The whole lot had just been thrown together. There was no way any of it was going to be waterproof. Then Corey and I had realised that we'd run out of bags and the shop we'd bought them from had shut for the evening. We ended up having to leave one load in the box. Not the best place to store something for a 70-mile trip across the sea, but we just didn't have any other choice. By the time we finished, it was almost a rendezvous time, and Corey started taking charge again. He insisted on doing things by the book, parking about 2 miles away and walking down to the beach to check the coast was clear, walking back to the car, then bringing it a little closer. I just looked at him and shook my head. I'd already spent 24 hours too long in his company and it was really starting to get to me. Whether he was in charge or not, I wasn't going to behave like a prat unless it was absolutely necessary. "Who the fuck do you think you are?" I said to him. "Secret squirrel? Look, we're parking here and that's it. If the coast isn't clear, we'll see it from the car and then we can drive away. If you don't like it, you can just fuck right off." That pissed him off something rotten. So after we put our waterproofs on and started taking the bags down to the beach, he stormed off in a huff, and in the wrong direction. I pointed out that he was at the first concrete pipe, and that the meeting place was at the second one. He looked at me with daggers in his eyes. Basically, he was so pissed off with me that he didn't want to agree about anything. If I told him his name was Peter, he'd have wanted to have a row about it. "No it ain't, it's always the first one." I shook my head. "No it isn't. The reason it isn't, moron, is because the first one you'd be too close to the pier." "Darren, I think you're forgetting who's in charge here." So I left it. By now Mick was 5 minutes late, and Corey was already in quarter panic mode. We were sitting in a sand dune on this little mound of grass surrounded by bags of puff, looking out over the water and listening to the radio for Mick to come in. But he didn't, and there was nothing we could do apart from wait. And wait. 15 minutes later and Corey was in half panic mode. I was starting to feel a bit uncomfortable myself. There were all these people taking their dogs out for a walk on the beach, passing within just a few yards of us each time. And as they passed us, their dogs were going absolutely mad for the drugs. I mean, these dogs were going crazy for the stuff, tearing at their leashes and barking like crazy. And all we could do was sit there in our waterproofs with these dodgy-looking bags and pretend that we didn't know what was going on. And wait, and wait. Mick was now 25 minutes late, and Corey had missed out the interim stage and gone into full-blind panic mode. He grabbed one of the bags, the lightest one, surprise, surprise, and ran down to the water, desperately scanning the sea for any sign of Mick. Just then, the radio crackled into life. "Sparky, come in, Sparky." "Yeah, I'm here." "Okay," said Mick, "flash your torch." I did, and he told me he couldn't see it. I flashed it again, but he still couldn't see it. "Where are you? I'm at the beach," he yelled. "I'm actually on the sand. Where are you?" I grabbed the other bags and dragged them down to the beach, but still couldn't see Mick, let alone hear the boat. Corey was literally running around in circles and generally being useless, so I flashed the torch again. "I see you," said Mick. "You're in the wrong place. You're bloody miles away. What are you doing down there?" Mick had quite rightly parked at the second concrete pipe, so Corey and I had to drag all the drugs about 1/4 mile to where he was. There was no point in explaining. I knew that whatever I said, Corey had a good 4 hours to convince him that it was my fault, so I just pushed the boat back out to sea and waved him goodbye, and good riddance. I thought I'd had more than enough excitement for one night, but unfortunately, it wasn't quite over yet. I'd parked the Toledo right next to this karate club, and when they saw some bloke in waders struggling to get into a car, my hands were freezing from the water and I couldn't work the lock properly, they thought I was a car thief. The next thing I know, there were 25 massive blokes in judo suits running towards me shouting out in French. I didn't have a clue what they were saying, but I decided I wasn't going to hang around to find out. I got in the car and watched them grow small in my rearview mirror. What a night. I drove back to Amsterdam and got totally lost trying to find the car hire place. So in the end, I flagged down a cab and got him to drive there so I could follow him. After that, I got the cab to take me to the Delta Hotel. It was too late to get a ferry back to England, and I fancied a few beers anyway, so I spent the night in Stone's bar talking bollocks and drinking myself into a stupor. By the time I got back to the hotel, I was shattered. I slept like a baby. It might have been a bit of a nightmare, but at least nothing else could go wrong. Just after 2:30 AM on the 8th of November 1995, Essex Police Constables Crick and Cohen were called to Felixstowe Ferry car park to investigate a report of 3 men landing a boat in suspicious circumstances. The pair arrived to find a blue D-Reg Range Rover attached to a trailer with a large inflatable boat on it in the car park close to the sailing club. The side lights of the Range Rover were on and the doors were open, but there was no one around. PC Cohen was examining the vehicle and making a note of a large iron bar that had been placed between the front seats when someone came running over from the direction of the sea defences. "Oh," said the man, slowing down when he realised that he was dealing with 2 policemen. "I thought someone was trying to steal my motor." "So all these items belong to you, do they, sir?" asked PC Crick. "Well, the boat is, but the Range Rover belongs to my brother. We've just been out diving, me, my brother and Gordon Stevens." "You just missed my brother. He drove off about 10 minutes ago. He's got all the wetsuits and diving gear with him." "Diving in the middle of the night? What's the point? You can't see anything." The man scratched his head for a second. "Well, the thing is, the water's not that clear anyway, so it's just as good as night as it is during the day. But anyway, we didn't get much diving in. We had a bit of trouble with a boat. That's why we've been out so late." "I see, and what would your name be, sir?" asked PC Crick. "Womes," came in reply. "Jack Womes." Just then, a second man appeared by the slope over the embankment, but vanished again as soon as he saw what was going on. PC Cohen rushed over to try and find him. At the top of the slope, he looked to his left and saw the lights on in a wooden beach cabin called Feronia. He could see a man standing by the window looking at him and walked to have a word. The man identified himself as Gordon Stevens, and according to Cohen, behaved in a way that looked evasive and uncomfortable. He said he had helped a couple of people who had difficulty with their boat on a sandbank but didn't know their names. PC Cohen asked if he could look inside the house to see if anyone else was there. Stevens refused. By now, other police officers were starting to arrive, and they escorted 2 men who had been hovering around the nearby sand dunes to PC Cohen just outside Feronia. Both men refused to give their names. One of them was in a furious mood. "Why the hell have you surrounded this bloke's house with these police officers? He hasn't done anything wrong. This is his own, for fuck's sake. Don't you people have any respect?" Eventually, the man calmed down and reluctantly gave his name. Michael Steele. When no one reacted, no one instantly reached for the handcuffs, he seemed almost surprised. As far as the police were concerned, he wasn't one of the men who had been in the boat with Jack Womes. He clearly knew Gordon Stevens, but that was the only connection they could come up with. He was pretty much free to do what he wanted. Once Steele had relented and given his name, the man with him finally agreed to do the same. He was Peter Corey. The police now concentrated their efforts on Womes. It was his boat after all, and they needed his permission in order to search it. Nothing was found, so Womes was told to wait till customs officers arrived, while Steele and Corey simply wandered in and out of Stephen's house, chatting quietly to one another. With hindsight, it might have seemed a little naive, but at the time the officers at the scene felt they were doing the right thing. There didn't appear to be anything in the boat, and although the men were acting a little suspiciously, there really didn't seem to be anything going on. When Steele asked if he could start cleaning the boat to prevent the salt deposits from building up on it, they saw no reason to say no to him. And so it was that customs officers arrived some 20 minutes later and saw their sworn enemy. The man they had vowed would never make them look stupid again, washing down his flashy new boat with a bucket of hot soapy water. It was then that Steele got the treatment he'd been expecting all night long. There were a chorus of screams. "Get that man the fuck away from that boat!" And Steele and the others were dragged away in handcuffs. At 4:25 AM, Steele, Womes and Corey were all arrested for being concerned in the importation of drugs. The process of gathering evidence against them began. Back in Basildon, Tony Tucker was having a sleepless night. He wasn't worried about Steele and the drugs. As far as he was concerned at that time, everything was going according to plan, and his little £15,000 investment was about to double in value. Tucker was nervous because the previous evening he had performed the ultimate act of friendship. He had given Pat Tate the keys to his black Porsche so he and his new girlfriend Lizzie could go for a spin down to Southend. Tucker was in a difficult position. Tate was his best friend and a fully grown man. You couldn't treat him like a child. But then again, Tate had only been out of prison for a couple of weeks and was smack bang in the middle of this hedonistic bender where he was burning the candle at both ends and living life to the limit. Rather like an irresponsible teenager. So irresponsible, in fact, that despite the fact he was driving his best friend's valuable and cherished sports car, Tate had spent most of the day indulging in his favourite cocktail, Special K and cocaine. The result was inevitable. As he sped across a mini roundabout on the edge of the A127, he lost control and smashed headfirst into a set of railings, instantly converting Tucker's pride and joy into a twisted heap of scrap metal. By then, Tucker had heard that Steele had been arrested, but he had no idea what was going on. When Tate phoned to tell him about his car, he just started ranting and raving, screaming out abuse. That fucking bastard, all he was trying to do was impress some silly young tart. Tucker was even more pissed off because Tate, still high on drugs, couldn't stop giggling. Even when he explained he'd been arrested on suspicion of having stolen the car, driving without insurance and driving under the influence, he'd break into a big belly laugh every few sentences. Then, to rub salt in the wounds, a still giggling Tate asked whether Tucker would mind getting into one of his other cars, driving down to Southend Police Station and giving him a lift home. Under the circumstances, it was almost a pleasure for Tucker on his arrival to tell Tate that Steele had been arrested. Although Tucker stood to lose some cash, Tate had put more than £55,000 into the deal, most of it borrowed from other people. If the deal had gone belly up, Tate was going to have to find the cash to repay the debt. Right away, Tate went very quiet. Tucker then said he would arrange for someone to come and get him before slamming down the phone and calling Craig Rolfe. By the time we got there, it was obvious that Tate knew all about Steele being arrested. Rolfe's girlfriend Donna Jaggers told the police later. He had the most money in the deal, and he was anxious to find out what was going on. He couldn't make the call while he was banged up, so as soon as he got in the car, he grabbed Craig's phone and called Jackie Street. She told him everything was safe, and immediately he seemed to calm down a lot. But it only lasted a few minutes. Once he was sure his investment was safe, Tate soon began to get hyped up once more. He demanded to know if Rolfe had any cocaine or ecstasy on him and insist they make a detour to find some. When Jaggers protested that she and Craig had plans for that evening, Tate suddenly exploded in a fit of rage. He started smashing his fists up and down on the dashboard, screaming at the top of his lungs that all he wanted was a good time and they shouldn't be so uptight. It was like watching a kid having a tantrum. Then Tate started bragging about all the deals he had in place, about how rich he was going to be in just a few days' time. How he was going to set up his own smuggling ring with his brother and hire a new cheaper pilot than Steele to bring the stuff over. How he was going to get a bigger house, a brand new Merc, how he'd even buy Tucker a new Porsche to make up for breaking the last one. Whatever planet Tate was living on, it certainly wasn't Earth. Just after 6 p.m, more than 12 hours after being arrested, Jack Womes found himself sitting opposite Customs Officer Rodney Sales. Having been friendly and talkative earlier that morning when he thought he might be able to bluff his way out of trouble, Womes now resorted to a classic criminal technique, the no comment interview. Right, Mr. Womes. Well, I want to ask you about events at around 2:30 this morning, but really I want to start yesterday afternoon. I want to start with the other people, if I may. Do you know a Michael John Steele? Is that no reply? If it's going to be no reply, can you say no reply or Jack cleared his throat? No comment. No comment, okay. Do you know a Gordon Edward Stevens? No comment. Do you know Peter Corey? No comment. I feel bloody stupid asking you this, but do you know your brother John? Womes? No comment. Now come on, Jack. Surely you know your own brother. No comment. And so it went on for the remainder of the 7-minute interview. Michael Steele had little short of a lifetime's experience of the interview room behind him. He knew his rights and he knew the law only too well. And as Customs Officer Richard Hills was about to find out, with a villain of that calibre, unless you've got a cast iron case on the table in front of them, they'll never admit to anything, and they'll make your life hell for even daring to try. Right, Mr. Steele, Hills began. You were arrested at Felixstowe Ferry this morning. What were you doing there? Let me explain something to you before we go any further. Yesterday morning, I think I was asked my name and address 6 times by different officers. Now that one little bit of information has led me to being arrested and charged with a serious offence. I was brought to this police station, strip searched, put into a cell, no ventilation, no urinal, no drinking water and no bedding. Furthermore, I'd like to explain to you that as of this moment, I've got nothing whatsoever to say to you for this simple reason. You've arrested me on what I call a trumped up charge, and anything I say now in answer to your questions will be no comment. No comment, no comment. And to save yourself and me any further time wasting, I'll explain to you now that I don't intend to answer any questions. I've done nothing wrong, and for that reason I'm not answering any questions, and it's because of the way I've been treated. Therefore, I'm going to answer no more questions as of now, and for anybody who reads or listens to this tape later orally or in transcript, I don't want to sound unreasonable by sitting here being quiet while you put question after question to me, but I'll tell you now, I'm not answering any of your questions. I've no intention of doing so. I've no need to answer the questions. I've done nothing wrong, and like I say, so far, all I've done is give 6 people my name and address that's landed me up in here. Nothing further, nothing more to say, as of now. And that was that. Steele refused to utter another word throughout the remainder of the 8-minute interview. Finally, it was the turn of Peter Corey, with Richard Hills doing the honours once again. At first, it seemed that Corey might be the weak link with the loose tongue. He was offered a solicitor but declined, wrongly assuming that the customs officials would believe he had nothing to hide if he didn't want one. But not having had the opportunity to speak to the others and find out what their stories were, he soon realised he was painting himself into a corner. "OK," began Hills. "You were arrested this morning at Felixstowe Ferry in the early hours of the morning. What were you doing there?" "I was coming in on a boat." "What sort of boat was that?" "Diving boats." "I don't know the names, just went out in them." "Right, and I take it that the boat is not your property then?" "It's definitely not mine, no." "Whose is it?" "Well, as far as I know, it's Mr. Steele's." "And what was the purpose of the trip in the boat?" "He put a lot of work into it. He wanted to go out and test the computer on board, whatever it is. I think that's what he said." "Do you want to come out?" I said, "Yeah." "I see. Did you launch the boat from Felixstowe Ferry?" "Where's Felixstowe Ferry?" "It's where you were arrested last night." "Oh, yes, yeah. After that, Corey's answers to Hill's questions became more and more vague, until he finally realised that he was making the situation far worse and requested a solicitor. 40 minutes later, Corey was back in the hot seat with a new attitude and confident response to the questions. "I've said all I'm going to say," he told Hills, bringing the proceedings to an unexpectedly premature end. Later that evening, the news came back from the Customs Forensic Lab that cannabis resin had been found on the deck of the boat. But it was no cause for celebration. The total weight was 262 micrograms. It wasn't enough to charge someone with personal possession, let alone with smuggling. It wasn't even enough to roll a decent joint. The Range Rover had been examined and it was clean. Customs had no choice but to let the trio go. Darren Nichols had left the Delta Hotel early in the morning to catch the train that would take him to the ferry terminal. Totally oblivious to the events back home, he booked a cabin and spent most of the journey losing even more money on the roulette wheel, then drowned his sorrows in the bar. Back in Harwich, he bought some duty-free lager for himself and a pile of cigarettes for Sandra, then made his way to his car for the drive home. Darren Nichols states, "I switched on my mobile phone as I thought I'd probably have a message from Mick or Jack, but there was nothing. I tried calling them on their mobiles but couldn't get through, so I called Sandra and told her I was on my way back. I kept trying Jack and Mick all the way back to Braintree with no luck, so finally I tried Mick at home. Jackie Street answered. 'Hi Darren,' she went. 'Mick's not here at the moment. There's been a bit of a misunderstanding. He was out fishing in his boat and Customs thought he was up to something, so they arrested him coming into Brighton-Sea Marina. Everything's going to be okay though.' Mick was a clever git. He knew only too well that someone might be listening in on the phone, and he wasn't going to give anything away. By telling Jackie that everything was going to be okay, he was giving me a clear signal that the drugs had already been unloaded and that Customs hadn't found anything. Mick didn't get home till really late that night, so I didn't get to see him until the next day. Customs had held onto the Range Rover and the boat for further forensic examination, and I wanted to get the full story. With a big grin on his face, he explained that once they'd unloaded the drugs and stashed them safely in Mick's mum's garage, they decided to get the boat out of Brightlingsea, where they had been spotted by the harbour master, who, unbeknown to them, had called the police. Mick's friend Gordon Stevens lived right on the beach, so once the boat was on the trailer, they all stopped off for a cup of tea. Jack remembered he'd left the lights on in the Range Rover and went to turn them off, but he never came back. When Mick went to find him, he poked his head over the embankment and saw Jack being interviewed by the two coppers, and then dashed back to the house. He and Peter took all the incriminating evidence they could find, receipts from abroad, foreign money, maps, backup coordinates for the GPS, everything, and burned them in the toilet. Mick had been trying to avoid giving his name because he knew that with his track record they'd clap him in the irons as soon as he did. Only they didn't, so he decided to call their bluff. While they were waiting for customs to arrive, he made an excuse about needing to get on the boat and deprogram the GPS. That was pretty crucial because the system stores all the coordinates of the last journey. If anyone had looked at it, they would have seen that Mick left early the previous day, made a brief stop in Blankenberg, a brief stop in Point Clear, and then come back to the marina. Mick wouldn't have a leg to stand on. But as it was, he was able to get rid of the evidence. He still had time to kill and the police did seem bothered. So he gave them a story about needing to get salt water off the boat and began washing down the insides, hoping to get any loose traces of cannabis out. And he'd virtually succeeded. Mick was totally relaxed about the whole thing. In fact, he thought it was really funny that they'd blown it, and he kept right on laughing about it as he took me to his mum's garage in his Hilux and gave me a couple of kilos to sell. It was another story he could add to his list of narrow escapes. He was totally convinced that it was just bad luck, that they'd been spotted by the harbour master. But I wasn't so convinced. Now, I've got no way of proving it, but I'm pretty sure that I'm right about what really happened that morning. Everyone knows that customs don't find fuck all by pure chance. Most of the time they're acting on tip-offs. And when they swooped on Mick and Jack, I think they were acting on a tip-off that they should be on the lookout for a certain small boat coming back in from the sea in the early hours. And who did the tipping? I think it was Dopey Harris. Why him? Well, for one thing, that was the trip that he found out that we took the stuff back to England by boat. None of us knew about the second reason at the time, but once we did, it became blindingly obvious that Harris had absolutely nothing to lose and £124,000 worth of everything to gain. Okay, so interestingly here we have Darren Nichols talking us through the entirety of the situation, the purchasing of the drugs, the bringing them back into the UK, Steele and Wombs being arrested or taken in for questioning, and all of those issues which were faced upon arriving in Amsterdam. But interestingly, what stands out to me is that he doesn't mention Pat Tate. He doesn't say, well, Steele had been having some issues with Tate, maybe Tate had informed on him, maybe Tate had called the police. But I think what is a possibility here, and again I'm just talking about possibilities, it is a possibility that Steele's thought to himself, well, hang on a minute, we've done this trip a number of times, we haven't been caught up until now, I'm very careful with what I do. We take all the precautions necessary. We do it under the cover of darkness. We use a small boat. We get over there. We get back, and it's a fairly well-run operation. And on this occasion, as I say, they nearly got caught. So somewhere in Steele's mind, would he be thinking, how has that happened? How have they found this small boat coming across from Holland? Who exactly has tipped them off? From here, you would imagine that Steele, after being questioned, went home, and one of the first things that Jackie Street is going to say to him would be, yeah, Pat called up, he already knew that he had been arrested, and he was checking about where the drugs were they safe? Somewhere in your mind, surely you'd think to yourself, well, how the hell did Pat Tate know if he was in prison? If he was in custody, I should say, I keep saying prison. If he was in custody, if he was off the streets at this time period, and the first thing that he says upon leaving the police station and getting in the Range Rover is, where is Steele and Wombs? They've been arrested. Where are the drugs? And he's ringing up Jackie Street asking if the drugs are okay. Surely somewhere in Steele's mind he's thinking, how the hell did Pat Tate know that? But interestingly, as I say, if this was some kind of story, put together by Darren Nichols, you would have thought that he would have mentioned it at the end of that last paragraph there, but he doesn't. He mentions the man from Holland being potentially responsible as the person that grassed them up, as the person that, called the authorities and alerted them to the boat coming in from Holland. He doesn't mention Pat Tate at all, so I do find that quite interesting. Anyway, take a listen to the following. Around 6 p.m. that day, Craig and I drove to Southend Police Station to collect Tate. Once in the vehicle, I became aware that Tate already knew about Steele being arrested. He then used Craig's mobile phone to ring Jackie Street. He asked her if everything was safe. I took it that it was as a result of Tate's manner, and subsequently what he said to Craig. He said that it was all safe. I took this to mean that the drugs had not been found. On this occasion, I did not know where the meeting between Steele and the others was to take place. But after a couple of days, Craig brought his share of the cannabis round to our house in Chafford 100. Okay, so that was the official police statement, or part of the official police statement given by Donna Jaggers. So I would say on the balance of probability that this story, this version of events did actually happen, in that Craig and Donna attended Southend Police Station, they collected Tate, and Tate was already aware of Steele's arrest. The first thing he does is call Jackie Street to check that the goods are safe. So this version of events, this story did actually happen. I mean, what that means, I don't know. I mean, could Tate have been told by someone else? Could he have been told by someone inside the police station? Did he receive a phone call before he was picked up? We don't know, do we? We don't know. But what we can say is that what Darren Nichols has stated there and what Donna Jaggers has stated happened does sound like the truth, does sound like a factual event. After that, I didn't see Mick again until the new year. He'd ring me up every now and then and ask me to do some electrical or other building work at his house, and like some spineless dog, I'd always say yes. I felt pretty shit every time, but the truth is I just didn't know what else to do. In my mind, I was as guilty of the murder as anyone else. If it ever came on top, all it would take was for one of them to say that I knew all about it and agree to drop them off and pick them up afterwards, and that would be it. I'd be doing life right alongside them. But the more I saw of Mick after the murders, the less I believed that he would ever stitch me up like that. He wasn't the same person anymore. Whenever we were alone together, he'd start trying to justify the killings to me. He'd start off by saying how all three of them were scum and that no one was missing them, that he'd done the world a favour. Then he'd talk about the fact that even Sarah Saunders, even though she'd lost the father of her kid, was much happier now that Pat was dead. He told me that when the police had questioned Sarah, they'd asked her if she knew anyone who might want Pat dead. She said she didn't. Then they said, well, do you know anyone who might want Pat dead because they found out that he was informing on them? Mick was always convinced that Pat was a grass, and finally through Sarah, he'd got confirmation. You see, Darren, he told me, that's another reason to have that cunt killed. Okay, so by all accounts, this was a conversation which transpired after the deaths of Tucker, Tate and Rolfe between Michael Steele and Darren Nichols. Now, let me make it clear in this video, I'm by no means saying that Pat Tate was a grass or a police informer. I'm trying to look at this from the perspective of Michael Steele and if this was a genuine concern of his. Let's just remember, not so much the fact that they got caught on this trip, bringing back this gear, it turned out to be done, it was a load of hassle, they had to get the money back, all of that sort of stuff, and the pressure that was coming down from Tucker, Tate and Rolfe onto Michael Steele during that time period. But let's look at how those individuals were actually behaving, the drug usage, the aggressive, violent behaviour conducted by particularly Tucker and Tate, the out-of-control nature of these individuals as a whole. Would Steele, somewhere in the back of his mind, have thought to himself, since I've brought these individuals on board, since I've brought them into the fold, as it were, made them a part of this empire or this drug importation business, everything has started to go wrong. Since Michael Steele became involved with Tucker, Tate and Rolfe, you had the situation with Leah Betts falling into a coma and then subsequently dying, the pressure that brought on everybody from the media, the police, raiding the clubs, all of that sort of stuff. And then Michael Steele, who by his own admission had been running a fairly smooth operation, bringing his stuff into the country. Then all of a sudden they get an investment from Tate and they're nearly caught. In the back of his mind somewhere, did he think to himself, someone has set me up here. Someone has grasped on me. Someone has told the authorities that I'm coming ashore with these goods. It's certainly worthy of consideration, and particularly, how did Pat Tate know that Steele had been arrested when he himself was in custody during that time period? Anyway, do leave your own thoughts and theories down in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up before you leave and subscribe to the channel down below. Very shortly, you'll be able to see over 300 videos that I've created on this case in the past, so do feel free to work your way through those at your leisure. And as always, many thanks for joining me for this one. I'll see you all again in the next one. Take care. Cheers.